A late start today, because that's what I was talking about. We're on the lesson, The Response of Islam to the Modern World. And I want to kind of say a few things from the get-go, see if there's any questions before I jump into it. Because what we're dealing with is the Renaissance and then the 17th and 18th century. And last week, I don't know, I got really excited and I covered about 5 centuries of human history, in about 40 minutes. That's a lot of history to cover. But we're going to pick up on that today. So I felt like I covered too much material too quickly, but in all fairness, broadly speaking, the main themes are that in the Middle Ages, all of the center of gravity of civilization shifts to the west and to the Atlantic Ocean. Islam finds itself commander of territories that people no longer cared about. I mean, they still cared about them, but it wasn't what was up and coming. The Turks that governed Turkey and most of the rest of the Islamic Empire were exceedingly violent and oppressive. They were powerful, very, very powerful. But what happens in that time period is that Islam begins to feel like it has been left behind. I believe that it was left behind. As a Christian, I believe that Islam is a fundamentally medieval movement. It has some eternal truths in it, but it really does belong to the Middle Ages. It doesn't really have a whole lot of history that precedes the Middle Ages, and it has had great difficulty in adapting itself to the modern world. And so that now becomes the struggle. We did mention that there were 2 major states, Egypt and what will eventually become known as Saudi Arabia, who pull themselves away from the Ottoman Turks and begin to try to set foundations for the progress of Islam in the modern world. And there's a couple things about that that I want to mention. A couple questions that come up last week that I don't necessarily feel that I did a good job dealing with. Islam is advancing in the world today. It's probably second only, if not more quickly advancing than Christianity. I don't think Islam is advancing spiritually, culturally, or intellectually. And for me, being who I am, that matters. But there's no question Islam is advancing in terms of its power and its influence globally. So that's the first thing. And then somebody had asked a question, I don't remember who, about Wahhabism in Arabia. Arabia today is not the Arabia that was in the 19th century. Arabia in the 19th century was rebooted by Wahhabism. And Wahhabism is a Sunni movement, every bit as aggressive and every bit as much behind what today in the West we call terrorist activity as Iran. But Arabia today, many of you know that Arabia actually has entered into some pretty constructive political engagement with the West. So Wahhabism has sort of gone underground within Arabia, but it's still there. And so 2 really, what I thought were very well-informed, sharp questions that came up last week. Wahhabism is what helped create the state of Saudi Arabia. But it's not what Arabia officially endorses. But it is definitely behind most of the Sunni terrorist activity that goes on in Arabia today, just as Iran and the Shiite group there is behind so much terrorist activity.
One very current example of what Saudi Arabia is trying to do in the modern world is that about a year or so ago, they created a new professional golf league. And they lured some of the very best golfers from America into their camp because they were paying them huge amounts of money, largely oil money, and it's still in the process of being battled out. They're banging away at each other, and you read about it almost every day.
I'm sorry, Pastor Dan, that's over. They already agreed.
You're old news.
It's over.
Well,
That's done and over. They told the PGA like it or leave it, and PGA merged it.
yeah, I'm not sure. I think you're right. I think it's not over.
Oh, come on, it's your turn. Go.
Hey, I know, first of all, I'd be happy if you're right. I'd be happy if you're right, so I'm arguing.
Well, I don't know that much. I mean, I know
The PGA caved so quickly, and
right.
players got
As
caught.
I understand it, the PGA board is still negotiating on how they're going to handle their
Well,
side.
there were, like the Live Tour had the shotgun stars.
Right.
And they're trying to get. Yes, hey, here, now this will be an incisive comment, guaranteed, right?
Very important question. It's live. I was wondering if it's live.
I have no idea, LIV, I think it might be the Latin letters, Roman letters.
Oh,
Chad might know, 'cause he's into that.
If it's ancient and irrelevant, I probably know it.
The point is that a major Islamic country is trying to work something in the modern world.
I agree
that,
with you, and also I think boxing and places like that are next.
Yeah.
And then, I just want to really make Brandon this here, I think American football's next.
We could take the NFL and college football.
I know I really actually do appreciate all of that. Because I teach language, I teach history, I teach all of these subjects. And C.S. Lewis once described himself as a guy who shovels coal into a engine, but has his back to where the engine's headed. And sometimes I think that's a good description of me. I'm always a day late and a dollar short as far as what's currently going on. Ask me in 50 years, I'll tell you what happened. So that's what we're doing. And some of you kind of have a foot in the door with a little bit of what's going on in contemporary culture. And so that's incredibly valuable information, how we got there. So a little bit in terms of where we're at, the place, the time, the circumstances for the development of Islam. The Ottoman Turkish Empire will break down over the course of the First World War, particularly, and then the Second. When that happens, these territories will, kind of like the modern Soviet Union, become sort of what we call splinter states. And then they'll have to develop their own identity. Egypt becomes a very liberal Islamic state. They want to develop women's rights. They want to develop free education. They want to develop parliaments. This doesn't sit well with the medieval way of doing things, but is very, very modern. Wahhabism in Arabia is very against that. And so they sort of set the tone for what modern Islamic states are going to have to do. And when we look at all of the violence and the conflict that goes on in the Middle East, much of it arises out of this conflict. Because post-World War II, will have about 6 or 7 Muslim states. But once the Western powers begin decolonizing Africa and the Middle East, we have over 50 Muslim states, each one of them just in my own lifetime come into being and trying to decide what kind of government they're going to have. And it's a highly charged situation. So sometimes I speak about the Cold War, which we think of as the America versus the Soviet Union, but I also say that there's a Muslim Cold War going on in the modern world. There's a Muslim Cold War. And it's a war about how these incipient states are going to, what kind of government they'll have. How much are they going to participate in the Western tradition of freedom, democracy, and equality? What are they going to do about that? So on page 39, we started off, I've got this section here called Mujahideen, Prophets, and Mahdis. In this situation, the Mujahideen are Muslim freedom fighters. They create these jihad states that really fight for Muslim rights and control in a very military way. So we might think of them kind of like in the New Testament, Jesus had a disciple named Simon the Zealots. And the Zealots were Jewish freedom fighters. They were killers. They fought violently for the freedom of Israel against Roman control. The Mujahideen you can think of as sort of the modern Muslim zealot. Then we have prophets. Top of page 40. Sheikh Ahmad, first line on top of page 40, who began to argue that the Quran contained passages that had more than met the eye. And so that laid the groundwork for the rise of 3 Mahdis, this is where I'll pick up this evening, who appear in the 19th century. The Mahdi is the Muslim equivalent of the Messiah. The Mahdi is the man who has been in hiding and nobody knows who he is or where he's at or what he's up to, but he will rise, and when he does, he will unite the Ummah, the Muslim community, which is now divided between Shiite, Kharijite, Sunni, and other lesser groups. He's going to unite them religiously. He's going to unite them politically. And he will lead the Muslim people into some new utopia. Now, that's interesting because in many ways, Muslim history and development mirrors that of Judaism and contains many ideas that we recognize from Christianity. The first Mahdi, we only talked about these briefly last week, and so I'll go through them quickly on page 40. Ali Muhammad Shirazi came from Iran, that is ancient Persia, 1844. He believed himself to be a descendant from Muhammad, which makes him a Shiite. The Shiites believe that the leader needs to be directly related to Muhammad. Mild-mannered, but also pious, became an adherent of Shaikhism. Follower of this sect had recently arrived at the conclusion that they should begin searching for the Mahdi. The first to supply an answer to their demand was Shirazi, Ali Muhammad al-Shirazi. And then he came to refer to himself by the title the Bab, the door. That is an old Semitic word, Bab. Bab-ilah, from which we get the word Babylon, is an old Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian word for the door, the gate. So he calls himself the gate. said that he would unite the whole human race under a new age of Sharia law through his inspired interpretation of the Quran. So he's going to give a fresh interpretation of the Quran, inspired by God, and he calls himself the Bab, the door. His movement was forcibly suppressed, but it will give birth to the Baha'i faith. And I think some of you might not know about this guy, but you might have heard of the Baha'i faith. And the Baha'i faith, I put a whole footnote to it, has thousands of followers in its earliest expression. They suppressed it in Iran. Many thousands of followers were killed in 1850. Afterward, a follower of the door named Mirza Hussein Ali Nuri was released. He claimed to be the recipient of fresh revelations in 1866. He called himself the Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. He taught that mankind was a single race, that there needed to be a global society, misspelled there, and that all religions were from the one true God, and that it was time for all peoples everywhere to recognize their oneness and unite. Actually, the Baha'i faith, you might guess, is more popular in the West than it is in the East, because it's multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, interfaith in many ways. And so actually a large number of Christian pastors and Jewish rabbis will try to align themselves with the Baha'i faith because of its interfaith, the atmosphere of its interfaith connection. So that begins here with this first Mahdi. Let's see if there's any questions about Ali Muhammad Shirazi. Yeah.
Back when I was a minister in Troy, and I would attend various civic functions that, with the mayor and the powers that be in the city. But in any case, they would have kind of an interfaith sort of thing in which they would have a Muslim cleric do certain things, but they would have someone from the Baha'i faith do certain things, and then they would have a Hindu do certain things, and they would try to get a Christian to do certain things. But anyway, it was, it's on the map, I guess is what I would say, even locally here, the Baha'i faith.
Well, how many have heard of the Baha'i faith? You've all heard of it, even if you don't know anything about it. Several of you have. Exactly. Ali Muhammad Shirazi basically claims that the real meaning of the Quran has escaped us all. And he's going to tell us what it is. Which is interesting because you get a lot of people say the same thing about the Bible, right? There's always going to be some hotshot scholar who shows up one fine day and says, for the last 2,000 years, everybody, except me, of course, has gotten this wrong. And so he's going to come in, and so it becomes a multi-faith, interfaith movement. So the Baha'i faith is really popular in the West, though, because it actually fits in tidily with the West's political program, which is to bring everybody together on the same page.
I remember I was supposed to give the invocation at...
You did it in the name of Ali Muhammad Shirazi.
Well, the principal at Troy High said, before I went up, he said, don't be too specific.
Don't be too specific. All right, there you go. And what did you do? I don't want to put you on the spot. What did you do, Dad?
I said, I pray like you usually do, I guess.
He let you off the hook? Did you use the name of Jesus?
That was a big one.
That was a big
So that's a big one.
He did not want that.
He didn't want that. Yeah.
He did not want that.
So, could you have used the name of Allah, you think, in that situation?
No,
else has used the name of Allah and skated by without it? I'm curious, what do you think?
I don't know.
You're being very polite right now, very even keeled. I'll take Page's answer.
Well, I've only heard a handful, and it sounded to me like their prayers were designed for Westerners to hear. That was my impression. So they talked a lot about unity and about the brotherhood of the populations of the world and so on and so on. It sounded more like what they thought the audience wanted to hear, and I'm not sure whether they would do that in a mosque or not.
Oh, that was the Muslim. Oh, I thought that was the Baha'i. No. Can I just put-
Yeah.
So the Baha'i faith, I didn't realize it came out of the Muslim.
Comes out of Islam. A lot of people don't know that.
Right.
So is that tantamount to, well, I'm just wondering how Islam, because there are things.
Conservative Muslims do not regard the Baha'i as legit. They look at the Baha'i the way certain Christians look at sort of radical liberal Christians. What do I mean by radical liberal? We've all met the Christian church, the first church of the Universalist of Ralph Waldo Emerson. You know, where you feel like it's really wonderful and everything, but you don't know how Christian it really is. I think that's how they look at it, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, exactly.
But those are conservative Muslims. There are many Muslims who belong to the Baha'i faith, and they believe in it with all their chutzpah. In order for the Baha'i faith to work, you have to radically reinterpret the Quran in a way that it had not been interpreted for 1,500 years. That's what I would say. And then at that point, it can become a scholarly discussion. Is the Quran interpretable? Is it capable of being interpreted in this radical new way without doing damage to the language, the history, the text? And Christians are wrestling with that too. Some Christians want to interpret passages of the Bible in a radically new way. I'm fine with that, at least to countenance it. I'll say to anybody, tell me what your idea is. But then the question is, can you pull it off? Can you actually get this ancient Jewish or Christian text to say what it is that you want it to say? That's.
Maybe in postmodernism they can. They wouldn't mean anything
I read certain passages of the Bible, Old and New Testament, and at a certain point, for me, as a pastor and as a Christian, I'd say, look, I can't get this text to say any old thing I want it to. It would be better for me to say, you know what? I just figured I'm not a Christian. I'm going to walk away from that text. Or to say, no, this is what the text says. I have to come to grips with that. It condemns certain things, it approves certain things, and there's no easy way around it. So, but it's interesting that the Muslims deal with that too. Now into the 19th century, they're dealing with a significant problem, a religious breakdown, and they're going to come up with some wild new movements. So the second one we have here on page 40, Muhammad Ahmad, he comes from the Sudan about 30 years later, 40 years later in 1881. He's a Sunni Muslim, so that's the traditional party, but he's also a Sufi, which means a mystic. He also claims to be a descendant from the Prophet Muhammad. He's a local sheikh, which is a spiritual kind of mystic and advisor. He's a strong advocate of Wahhabism. He claims to be the Mahdi. He liberates his region from the power of the Turks. So you can see that many people want to get away from the Turkish Ottoman Empire. He creates a temporary state known as the modest Sudan. His followers call themselves the Ansar. In addition to rejecting the traditional schools of legal theory, they amend the confession of faith to include a reference to the Mahdi. And they amend the 5 pillars to include devotion to jihad. So they are aggressively violent, and they also have, as part of their confession of faith, a belief in the Mahdi, which is not, actually, if you think about it, not a part of original Islam. It's not evident that the Prophet Muhammad himself, if you asked Muhammad who's the Mahdi, he would have said, "What are you talking about?" He had no idea about this sort of messianic idea, because when he died, Islam was united. It was going in full strong. After 10 years, control of the country was restored via the intervention of the British, including Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was a soldier at that time before he became a statesman, and participated in the Sudan and got to know the Muslim community very well. I include in footnote 44 Winston Churchill's own record of his impression of the Muslim people. He wrote a book about his experience in the Mahdi War called The River War. You can still get it. You can buy it, and it's a first-person account from Churchill himself. How dreadful are the curses which Mohammedanism lays on its votaries. Besides the fanatical frenzy, which is as dangerous in a man as hydrophobia in a dog, he always had a way with words, there is this fearful fatalistic apathy. The effects are apparent in many countries. Improvident habits, slovenly systems of agricultural, sluggish methods of commerce, and insecurity of property exist wherever the followers of the Prophet rule or live. Churchill doesn't think that the Muslim community makes very practical men. The men are not practical. A degraded sensualism deprives this life of its grace and refinement, the next of its dignity and sanctity. The fact that in Mohammedan law every woman must belong to some man as his absolute property, either as a child, a wife, or a concubine, must delay the final extinction of slavery until the faith of Islam has ceased to be a great power among men. Individual Muslims may show splendid qualities. Thousands become the brave and loyal soldiers of the Queen. All know how to die, but the influence of the religion paralyzes the social development of those who follow it. That's an interesting statement by Churchill. Muslim men, they know one thing. They know how to die. And that's powerful, because the ability to die in the service of a great cause is a tremendous power. No stronger retrograde force exists in the world. Now, that's a statement. And you can take that home and think whether you agree with it or disagree with it. But in Churchill's view, this is the strongest retrograde movement in the world. That's a strong statement. Far from being moribund, however, Mohammedanism is a militant and proselytizing faith. It has already spread throughout Central Africa, raising fearless warriors at every step. And were it not that Christianity is sheltered in the strong arms, I wish our fundamentalist brothers could hear this sentence, the strong arms of science. the science against which it had vainly struggled, the civilization of modern Europe might fall as fell the civilization of ancient Rome. In spite of these views, another typo, Churchill also warned against the error in the opposite direction, especially in times of war. There are many people in England, and perhaps elsewhere, who seem to be unable to contemplate military operations for clear political objects unless they can cajole themselves into belief that their enemy are utterly and hopelessly vile. To this end, the dervishes, the Mahdi, and the Khalifa downwards have been loaded with every variety of abuse and charged with all conceivable crimes. This may be very comforting to philanthropic persons at home, but when an army in the field becomes imbued with the idea that the enemy are vermin who cumber the earth, instances of barbarity may easily be the outcome. This unmeasured condemnation is moreover as unjust as it is dangerous and unnecessary. We are told that the British and Egyptian armies entered Omdurman to free the people from the Khalifa's yoke, but never were rescuers more unwelcome. I included that full quotation because I think Churchill is remarkably sensitive and subtle and intelligent, and himself experienced firsthand war with the Muslims and interaction with the Muslims. I thought he had a lot of valuable things to say there. On the one hand, he's not an advocate of Muslim culture, but on the other hand, he doesn't seem to think that demonizing them and obliterating them is the right approach either. And so he takes what I would regard as a more nuanced view. Maybe it's a way to put it, yeah.
Kind of interesting that he's talking about treating them like vermin. You end up with all kinds of barbarity. And so when is this written? Because it's just...
This was written during the Mahdi War. Churchill was much older when he participated in, World War II. And so this is the early 1900s, I think.
It's kind of insightful for the world.
It is. Well, we talked a little bit about, what was it, Lawrence of Arabia? How many have seen Lawrence of Arabia? All right. Well, if you haven't, you go home and watch Lawrence of Arabia. He's talking about some of the virtues of the Muslim men. He doesn't think that they're devoid of virtue. He thinks that they have tremendous virtues. One is they're incredibly brave and they know how to die in the service of a cause, which in our present civilization, I don't think that you could say that about the modern American. How brave are they? How willing are they to offer up their life in the service of something they believe in? If we're fighting a civilization that has these virtues, we're going to have a hard time winning because who believes? Who believes in the cause for which they stand? Who's willing to lay down their life for the cause in which they stand? So Churchill admired that. But he did think that they were sensual. He thought that they were culturally backward. He thought that they were retrograde. And he had the courage of his convictions. Churchill lived before the time of sort of canceling out politically incorrect statements. I don't think that this statement would have made much headway in today's cultural climate. But it is an honest statement, and so I think it's valuable. Sometimes you can talk about historical events, big scale, which I often do, but really what you want to do is you want to find some individual of intelligence and ability who was there on the ground who can give you a very articulate expression of what it is they experienced there, and Churchill does that. I'll finish with the third Mahdi here, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're going to do next week. What was last week's lesson, Travis? Yeah, what was the name? All right, so this week has got to be the three Mahdis. That's got to be it, because that's kind of going to cover the whole class period. Top of page 41. The third claimant was Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, India, 1889. He was born into a family of Sikhists. He had a lot of regular contact with missionaries. From an early age, he was led to reflect on the similarities and the differences between Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. A pious recluse, he drew much attention to himself after suddenly declaring himself not only to be the Mahdi, but also the second coming of Christ. Now that's going to get some attention. So if you say, I'm not only the Muslim Messiah, but I'm the... Actually, does anybody know the name of the American religious movement who thought the second coming of Christ came in the form of a woman? And in the 1800s, shortly after the American Revolution started, what's the name of that religious group? The Shakers. We sing a hymn from the Shakers every morning at the school where I teach, and I wonder whether I'm the only one who knows that this is a Shaker hymn. But it's 'tis a gift to be simple, and the music is the Appalachian hymn from Aaron Copland. Does dun 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 dun. We all know that it's a very, very old American hymn. Now, there's nothing about the lyrics to the hymn that are explicitly Shaker. It's just a broadly pious hymn. But this particular Mahdi claimed to have been the return of Christ. He dressed also, however, in the likeness of Krishna, which is an important deity within Hinduism. So he's the Muslim Mahdi, he's the second coming of Christ, and he's also the Hindu Krishna. And what have you done? How old are you and what have you done? I attracted tens of thousands of followers. It proved, this is hardly surprising, far more successful among Hindus than Muslims or Christians. So the Hindus were all for it. They're like, oh man, this guy is it. Most Christians thought, I don't think he's the second coming of Christ. And most Muslims thought, I don't think he's the Mahdi. This, however, is called Ahmadiyya Islam. A number of books recently written by Ahmadiyya Muslims who have converted to Christianity have achieved some notoriety. And this accounts for about 1% of the global population of Muslims today, Africa, Asia, and Indonesia. So I footnote Ahmadiyya Islam is a very, very interesting branch of the Islamic faith. 1% is not a huge percent, so we shouldn't think of it as a majority movement. They believe that the Mahdi has returned. They also are against jihad, though, and they believe that Islam should spread through peaceful teaching rather than through violent coercion. So they are a peace-loving form of Islam. In that sense, we would think of them in connection with who? People like Gandhi. Now, Gandhi was not officially Muslim. He was Hindu. But he had a lot of connection with Ahmadiyya Muslims. And they had a shared ethos, you could say. They do recite the classical confessions of Islam, and they do practice the 5 pillars. So, giving to the poor, doing their daily prayers, reciting the confession, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and so forth. It was the only sect of Islam to condemn all forms of violence except for self-defense. So this is a non-violent form of Islam. It is widely rejected by the religious establishment. Its adherents by conservative Muslims are regarded as heretics. And again, it's about 1% of the global population. Now, what we're going to take a look at next week is toward the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, the Crimean War, which is still going on, apparently. The spread of Western imperial powers puts the Muslim faith as much on the defensive as it has ever been. And we're going to talk about the events leading up to World War I. But let me see if there's any questions or comments. What I wanted to do today basically is I felt like, for whatever reason, I pulled into high gear last week and covered centuries worth of material in a short space of time. What I want to do next week, though, is talk about the events leading up to World War I, World War II, and just kind of consolidate some of what we talked about. Let me see if there's any questions or comments about that. No? Yeah.
Egypt. Egypt was one of the Muslim countries that at least some of its leaders sought to modernize it and bring it into with what was happening in the West.
Yeah.
Would I be correct to assume that leaders like Anwar Sadat and Nasser and the famous assassination in Cairo were probably more radical groups from the lower regimes of Islam protesting against what they perceived to be a sort of a weakening of Islam by these leaders who were more open to Western ideas?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, yes. Particularly the Iranian Muslims, but that'll happen later when they gain power in Iran, later 20th century. And then the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia feel that the state of Egypt is capitulating to Western capitalism, Western democracy, Western Christian values.
You see the people of Iran, you see pictures from the 1960s where the women are dressed just the same as women in America. So that must be a similar thing.
Well, there are waves, they kind of go back and forth. Like
America had a strong presence in Iran prior to the overtake in Iran.
yeah, right.
And in some ways, the dress that you see there from the 60s would have been perceived by conservative Muslims as the corruption of the country. And so when the Shiites took control during the Carter administration, about the time I was born, 77. 77, it was the Ayatollah. And that was a big deal. At that,
Back in the days, that was happening. That was like the Paris of the East. It was quite the deal.
yeah. But America had a strong colonial presence there, controlling the politics of the country and so forth. So that was an attempt of conservative Muslims to retake, so to speak, their destiny for themselves, take it out of the hands of the West. And that process continued in the Middle East up until, of course, 9/11. That's the big event on our radar. But that story goes way back as far as their radar goes. We notice when something goes wrong. But within those communities, these have been things that they've been meditating on for a long, long time. Yeah. All right, we're past time. We've got to let you go. Thank you.